A racist police officer, John Miller, pulls a black woman, Rachel, out of her car for an unacceptable reason. But 4 minutes later, his world turns upside down, and he faces a brutal revenge that leaves him speechless. A seasoned officer, John Miller has served in the force for over 2 decades, always priding himself on his discipline and strict approach to enforcing the law. He believes his job is maintaining order through authority, never yielding to those who don't comply. To him, softness is a sign of weakness, and he never lets emotions interfere with his decisions. John sees himself as one of the few remaining tough people in a world he believes is growing softer daily. That afternoon, while patrolling a busy downtown street, John noticed a sleek black Mercedes parked along the curb. The car looked luxurious, which caught his attention. Sitting behind the wheel was a modestly dressed black woman named Rachel Taylor. Though he didn't know this yet, there was no clear reason to pull the car over, but an inner impulse led John to turn on his lights and signal the car to stop. Rachel, the woman in the car, calmly pulled over, keeping her hands on the wheel and looking into her rearview mirror. She was used to being extra cautious when dealing with police, especially in situations where the reason for the stop was unclear. John stepped out of his patrol car, his heavy footsteps sounding on the pavement, his gaze stern. Approaching Rachel's window, he looked directly at her with an intense, authoritative stare. Without explaining, he issued a short command. "Step out of the car immediately." Rachel frowned slightly but kept her calm demeanor. She responded, her voice steady but unafraid. "Sir, what have I done wrong? I believe I have the right to know why I am being stopped." Her question made John even more uncomfortable. In his 20 years on the force, he was accustomed to people complying without question. He felt challenged, interpreting her calmness as an act of defiance. "I don't owe you any explanation. Step out of the car right now," John said, his tone becoming more forceful. Rachel took a deep breath, still keeping her hands on the wheel, trying to keep her tone calm. "I understand, but I think asking for a reason is reasonable. I haven't done anything wrong. I've followed all traffic rules." Hearing this, a few pedestrians on the nearby sidewalk began to stop and watch. Their curious gazes were mixed with a hint of skepticism. A middle-aged woman crossed her arms, shaking her head disapprovingly, whispering to a friend next to her, "There's no reason to stop her. This is ridiculous." John started to feel the pressure from the people around him, but instead of calming him down, this only made him angrier. He leaned closer to Rachel's window, his voice full of menace. "You don't have the right to ask. Get out of the car immediately, or I will have to use stronger measures." Rachel kept her steady gaze, not letting any fear show on her face. She replied slowly, "I'm not trying to resist, but I need to know the reason. Otherwise, I feel this is an unfair act." Her calm yet direct words seemed to strike John deeply. He wasn't used to being opposed, especially by people he thought should comply without question. Feeling like his authority was being challenged, John didn't hesitate. He opened the car door roughly, grabbed Rachel's arm, and pulled her out forcefully. "What are you doing?" a man in the crowd yelled, his voice filled with outrage. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you pulling her out of the car?" Another woman took out her phone and began recording the scene unfolding before her. "This is an abuse of power. She only asked for a reason." Meanwhile, Rachel tried to stay calm despite being pulled out of the car so harshly. Her eyes remained fixed on John, showing no fear but a deep sense of disappointment. She softly spoke, just loud enough for him to hear. "Are you sure this is how a police officer should act?" Rachel's gentle yet frank words felt like a slap to John's pride. He handcuffed her without showing any sign of hesitation. "Save it for the judge," he replied, trying to sound tough, though his voice had lost some of its initial confidence. The crowd started murmuring, with several people voicing their disapproval more openly. "Let her go," a man shouted, while another woman shook her head in frustration. "There's no reason to treat her like this." Every angry gaze and every word of criticism made John feel surrounded, but his pride wouldn't let him stop or acknowledge that he had gone too far. He dragged Rachel toward his patrol car, ignoring the crowd's outcry and the disappointed looks of those around him. In John's mind, this was merely an act of asserting authority, a display of seriousness in enforcing the law. He had trained for years to be this kind of cop, tough, unyielding, and unwilling to let anyone question his authority. But what was? Unfolding in this moment had sown a deep anger in the hearts of the witnesses, raising questions about the fairness of those entrusted with upholding the law. That very evening, the video capturing John Miller forcefully pulling Rachel Taylor out of her car spread rapidly across social media. Thousands of shares and comments flooded online forums, condemning what the community perceived as discriminatory and an abuse of power. Posts consistently highlighted phrases like abuse of power, police brutality, and discrimination, quickly making John the focal point of a massive public outcry. Meanwhile, at the police station, Captain David Martinez, John's superior, watched the video with a cold, stern expression. He had never imagined that an officer from his precinct could act in such a way in front of the public. His feelings were a mix of anger and disappointment, not only in John's actions, but also in the significant impact they had on the police department's reputation. Without hesitation, he immediately summoned John to his office for a discussion. As John entered Captain Martinez's office, he could feel the tense atmosphere looming. Martinez sat upright behind his desk, his gaze coldly fixed on John. Before John could even sit, Martinez initiated the conversation. "Do you realize what you've done, Miller?" Martinez asked, his voice low but filled with disappointment. John maintained a calm face, trying to justify himself. "Sir, I was just doing my job. That woman refused to cooperate when I asked her to step out of the car, and I had to enforce my authority." Martinez gave a bitter smile, his eyes blazing with anger. "Enforce your authority? Miller, what happened to your responsibility to the public? Do you know how fast this video is spreading? People are looking at your actions and assuming this is the face of our entire police department." "But sir," John replied, his voice strained, "she wasn't cooperating. She challenged my authority, and I couldn't let that happen. A police officer has to maintain respect and authority. Without it, we lose control." Captain Martinez leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, examining John thoughtfully. "Respect? Do you think respect comes from force and abuse of power? True respect comes from protecting and serving the community, not by forcing authority for personal validation. You went against everything we're trying to build here." John frowned, still clinging to his stance. "But she wasn't following orders, sir. A police officer can't let anyone defy their commands. And for that, you think you have the right to pull her out of the car in front of a crowd without any clear reason?" Martinez's voice grew firmer. "Do you realize how many people witnessed this? How many phones recorded your actions? And now they're spreading everywhere as proof of police abuse." John fell silent, feeling frustrated but unable to respond. Martinez's words began to shake him, though his pride wouldn't allow him to admit his mistake. Finally, he stubbornly replied, "Sir, I only did what I thought was right." Martinez slammed his hand on the desk, his gaze growing even more intense. "Right? This is how you define right, Miller? We're not merely blind enforcers of the law. Our job is to protect and serve, to make the community feel safe, not afraid." John felt a heat rising in his chest, but outwardly, he remained composed. "I don't believe I did anything wrong, sir." "Then let me tell you," Martinez continued, his voice sharp, "you were completely wrong, and I won't let this go unpunished. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty. Your actions will be under investigation, and you'll likely face severe disciplinary measures." John froze, feeling a mix of shock and anger. "Suspended? For this one incident? I've served on this force for over 20 years. Martinez cut him off, his tone still icy. 20 years or 200, it doesn't matter if you don't understand the true meaning of the job you're doing. You've lost the community's trust, and that weakens our entire police force. As for your 20 years of service, I suggest you reflect on whether those years were truly dedicated to good, or if they've just become an excuse for your actions." John stood still, unable to respond. He felt both anger and confusion. He was used to the respect of his colleagues and superiors, but now he stood here, criticized and condemned, with none of his pride left. Finally, Martinez leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening slightly but remaining serious. "Miller, this isn't about you. It's about the community we serve. We cannot have a police officer who disregards the public's trust and believes they have the right to abuse their power. And I won't let anyone in this department, including you, destroy what we've worked so hard to build over the years." Martinez's words struck like a blow to John's pride. He didn't say another word, merely turning and leaving the office. His mind was filled with complex emotions, pride, anger, and a slight uncertainty about the values he had held for so long. As he walked through this hallway, John could feel a shift in how people looked at him. Every gaze, every gesture, carried an unmistakable coldness and distance, as if he had become a stranger in their eyes. Colleagues who had once been friends, who shared late-night patrols and tense chases with him, no longer approached him to exchange stories or friendly banter. Instead, they quietly moved away or whispered among themselves as he passed by. This feeling cut through John's pride like a cold blade, making him realize he was no longer part of the team he had once been so proud of. For John, the silent rejection from those he once considered teammates was deeply wounding. He couldn't help but wonder if they understood that everything he had done came from a sense of responsibility, from his desire to maintain discipline and fairness. Or did they now only see him as a symbol of abused authority and poor judgment? These thoughts haunted him, trapping him in a mix of guilt and confusion. The following day, in a meeting, John faced yet another round of relentless criticism from Martinez. Martinez not only spoke about John's actions as a personal failing, but emphasized the broad impact it had on the department's image. His words were sharp, like daggers aimed at John's pride, exposing flaws that John had always hidden behind his rigid and prideful exterior. Martinez made it clear that his actions had not only harmed an innocent citizen, but had eroded the trust the community placed in the police force, something the department had spent years building. Sitting silently in the meeting room, John could feel the judgmental stares of his colleagues. These were eyes full of disappointment, disapproval, and even reproach. Some looked away, unable to hide their distance. Others remained silent, but their gaze said it all. They no longer saw him as a trustworthy teammate. In the past, John had always believed he was doing the right thing by enforcing the law without compromise, using his authority to maintain order. But now, in this moment of isolation, he wondered if his principles and actions were truly justified. A feeling of loneliness settled over him, like a heavy cloak he couldn't shake off. For someone who had always been confident in his righteousness, this was a shocking realization. He had never imagined that one day he would find himself sitting here, facing the judgmental stares of colleagues and severe criticism from his superiors. This forced him to reflect on his actions and the path he had taken over the years. A path marked by rigid adherence to the law, harshness, and an occasional disregard for the humanity behind the rules. John remembered the times he had enforced the law without compromise, instilling fear and compliance. Those images now felt distorted in his mind, making him realize he had used his authority to mask his fears of losing control, fears of not proving his worth without rigid principles to cling to. He began to see that perhaps this rigidity had been a way of protecting himself from his insecurities. Throughout the rest of the meeting, John remained silent, seated quietly. He knew that arguing at this point would only make things worse. Within him, a silent struggle raged, filling him with torment and conflict. Martinez's words echoed in his mind, becoming a profound wake-up call. Could he change himself, change his views on authority and responsibility? Could he regain the trust of his colleagues and the community? These questions gnawed at him, giving him no peace. When John returned home, he was faced with an unsettling silence. His familiar surroundings now felt foreign, much like he did in the eyes of his colleagues. He realized that if he didn't change, he would be forever isolated, losing everything he once held dear. He no longer felt confident in the path he had chosen, and for the first time, he felt a need to seek a new direction, a new way to improve himself and heal the cracks within. That night, John lay awake, troubled by thoughts of the past and worries about the future. In his restless sleep, images of his cold, unyielding actions replayed like a slow-motion film. He realized it might be time to confront his mistakes, to learn to listen and understand rather than impose and judge. His heart grew lighter as he resolved to find a way to make amends, despite knowing the path ahead wouldn't be easy. With newfound determination, John understood that this was his moment to change, to become someone the community could trust and his colleagues could respect. After his suspension, John Miller received a message from Captain Martinez stating that, to keep his job, he was required to attend a 3-month empathy training course. This news hit John's pride like a punch, but what stung even more was that the course instructor was none other than Rachel Taylor, the woman he had wronged in the incident that sparked public outrage. The thought of facing her every week filled him with humiliation and intense discomfort. On the first day of training, John entered the meeting room with a cold expression, his gaze full of arrogance and defiance. He chose a seat in the back row, arms crossed, making it clear that he had no interest in this pointless class. To him, it was just a political show, a way to appease the crowd rather than provide any real training. Rachel entered the room, her demeanor calm and confident, carrying a thick binder of materials. She scanned the room, her gaze briefly meeting John's, but instead of showing any hostility or resentment, she looked at him with calm indifference. She smiled at everyone and began her introduction. "Hello, everyone," Rachel started, her voice steady and gentle. "I'm Rachel Taylor. This course isn't meant to blame or criticize anyone. It's an opportunity for us to understand the experiences and feelings of others, to build genuine empathy." John scoffed, muttering loudly enough for the person next to him to hear. "Empathy? Just some idealistic, weak nonsense. This isn't what cops need to do their jobs well." Rachel heard his comment but chose not to react. Instead, she continued, "We'll start by having each of you share a bit about yourselves and a time when you felt misunderstood or unfairly treated." A few people began sharing personal stories, from experiences of discrimination due to skin color or gender to being judged solely by appearances. When it was his turn, John scowled, visibly annoyed. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and looked at Rachel with a sarcastic gaze. Eventually, Rachel turned to him, maintaining a calm but slightly piercing look. "John, would you like to share something?" John sighed, his eyes full of challenge, his tone slightly mocking. "Honestly, I don't think I have anything to share here. I'm only here because I was forced to be, not because I feel the need to learn about empathy or weakness." Rachel held his gaze, unsurprised by his response. She nodded slightly, her voice still gentle but resolute. "I understand that you may not see this course as necessary, but empathy isn't a weakness, John. It's strength. The strength to understand and connect with others, to realize that everyone has their own story and their own pain." John scoffed again, his eyes flashing with defiance. "Strength? Sorry, but I've been a cop for over 20 years. I know what real strength is and what's weak. If we go soft and try to understand everyone, we lose their respect and lose the ability to maintain order." Rachel looked at him for a moment, her expression slightly saddened but determined. She stepped closer, her voice calm. "John, I'm not asking you to be weak or to ignore your duty, but I believe a truly strong person can listen and empathize without needing to rely on authority to force others into compliance." Unable to hold back, John's tone turned sharp. "You don't understand our work. Sometimes we don't have time to listen and empathize. We have to act, and that often means being tough." Rachel sighed, her gaze unwavering. "John, I'm not here to teach you how to be a cop, but imagine if someone constantly saw you through a lens of prejudice, never giving you a chance to explain or show who you are. Would that feel fair?" John hesitated for a moment but quickly brushed it off, his expression still defiant. "What you're saying sounds noble, but it's not practical. We cops face danger every day. Your empathy doesn't help us survive dangerous situations." Rachel looked at him, her eyes showing a hint of sadness but remaining composed. "John, have you ever tried to put yourself in someone else's shoes? Tried to understand what they feel, how it impacts them when they're treated as a threat just because of their appearance or background?" John stayed silent for a moment, then continued to counter. "I'm not here for moral lectures, and I don't need to put myself in someone else's shoes. I'm a cop. I have a job to do, and that job requires strength." Rachel looked at him, her face still calm but her gaze sharper, as if trying to pierce through his defenses. "John, sometimes the greatest strength isn't in being rigid, but in facing the truth about yourself and the effects your actions have on others. True strength is when you can open up to understand and change, even if it makes you uncomfortable." John felt an uncomfortable tension rising in his chest, as though Rachel's words were touching on something he didn't want to confront. But he quickly dismissed it, maintaining his cold gaze. In his mind, everything Rachel was saying was just weak theory, irrelevant to the harsh realities of police work. After the first session ended, John walked out of the room feeling irritated and tense. In his head, he kept repeating to himself that it was all meaningless talk and that this course wouldn't help him in his work. Yet deep down, a tiny seed of doubt had started to form, although he didn't want to admit it. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, lingering as something he couldn't easily dismiss. And in a brief, fleeting moment, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong about what true strength and responsibility meant. In the days that followed, John and Miller continued to attend the empathy training with a distant, defiant attitude. He stayed physically apart from others, maintaining a cold, unapproachable demeanor that he hoped would conceal the growing doubts in his mind, yet the stories he heard from others began to seep into his thoughts, chipping away at the emotional wall he had built over the years. One day, Rachel Taylor took the front of the classroom and shared her own story. She kept her voice steady, her eyes focused directly on John as if willing him to hear every word. "I'm not sure if any of you have ever been seen as a threat simply because of your skin color, but that's been my reality, from childhood through adulthood," she began. John, seated at the back, initially tried to tune her out, but Rachel's words slowly drew him into her story, despite his resistance. She recounted a memory from when she was a 16-year-old girl, stopped by police while walking home from school. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home," she said, her voice catching slightly. "But they saw a black girl in that neighborhood and assumed I was causing trouble. They made me stand by the curb, search my backpack, and didn't let me explain." A pang hit John's chest. He had heard stories like this before, but had never felt them so vividly. Rachel went on, her voice gentle, yet laced with the weight of bitter memories. "I could have reacted with anger or resentment, but my father taught me that real strength comes from compassion, from the ability to understand and listen, not from harshness or authority. That belief helped me turn painful experiences into motivation to create change so others wouldn't endure what I did." John looked directly at Rachel. She didn't appear weak or resentful. She simply stood there, recounting her experiences with an unusual calm that struck him deeply. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of doubt about his ideas of strength and authority. Perhaps true strength wasn't the rigid power he had clung to all these years. After Rachel's story, others in the class also began sharing their experiences. A middle-aged woman named Linda stood up, her eyes welling with tears as she began to speak. "I'm the mother of a son. He was stopped by a police officer and questioned simply for taking the wrong street home after basketball practice. He never came back." Her voice shook, but her tone remained firm. "I don't blame the entire police force, but I still wonder why my son had to bear the consequences of someone else's prejudice." John bowed his head, feeling a sharp ache in his chest. He tried to maintain his composure, but Linda's story haunted him. He had always thought he was simply doing his duty. But was it possible he had caused similar pain without realizing it? Next, a young man named Miguel stood up to share his story. Dressed simply in a t-shirt and jeans, Miguel had a strong build but carried a quiet pain in his eyes. "I was wrongfully detained on my way to my first job interview," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They said I matched the description of a suspect. And even though I explained I was on my way to an interview, they didn't listen. They handcuffed me and held me for 2 hours. I lost that job because of it." Each story, each disappointed, angry, and pained expression weighed heavily on John's heart. He remembered times he had made quick judgments, stopping people simply because they looked suspicious. Memories of those moments he had once taken pride in for upholding strict discipline now filled him with shame. Perhaps, without realizing it, he too had inflicted pain and injustice, denying people the chance to tell their side. At the end of that day's session, Rachel approached John, who was still seated quietly at the back of the room, his gaze fixed on the floor. She took a seat next to him, leaving enough space to keep him comfortable. "John," she spoke softly, but her voice was filled with sincerity, "I know these things may not be easy to hear. I know you've worked with discipline and dedication, but sometimes those very qualities become barriers that keep us from seeing the truth." John looked up at Rachel, his gaze a mix of confusion and hurt. He didn't say anything, but his expression betrayed the turmoil inside. "You don't understand what it's like to make split-second decisions, sometimes without time to consider someone else's feelings," he murmured, almost as if trying to justify himself. Rachel nodded, her gaze understanding. "I understand. I'm not here to say that your job is easy or without danger, but I believe that if we can listen and understand each other, we can do our jobs more humanely. Strength isn't a bad thing, John, but strength without understanding the stories and feelings of others only alienates us from the community we're meant to serve. Rachel's words felt like they were melting something inside John. He wasn't fully sure about this new perspective, but for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to push it away as he had before. Rachel's story, along with those from Linda, Miguel, and others, had left marks in his heart that wouldn't easily fade. He began to wonder if true strength lay not in imposing power, but in connecting with others with empathy. As he left that day, John was silent, but his thoughts were more complex than they had ever been. He realized that perhaps he had been mistaken about strength and authority, and that the very qualities he once dismissed as weak might hold the real power he needed to learn. In the days following each training session, John Miller felt his worldview crumbling bit by bit. He was no longer the steadfast, rigid police officer he once prided himself on being. The stories shared by Rachel and the other participants had left deep cracks in the wall of confidence he had built over more than 20 years. Restlessness, confusion, and a growing sense of guilt began to fill his mind. Every evening, John would sit alone, looking at the medals and awards on his shelf, testaments to his years of service. Each medal once symbolized pride, evidence of the decisiveness and toughness he believed defined a good officer. Now, however, they seemed dimmed, overshadowed by doubts and a sense of being lost. Every night, memories of past patrols replayed in his mind like a slow-motion reel. He remembered the time he stopped the young black man simply because he drove a nice car and looked suspicious. He recalled the frightened look on a woman's face when he ordered her out of her car in the middle of the night without explanation. Once he had seen these actions as expressions of strength and decisiveness, ways to protect the community. But now, each memory weighed heavily on him, as if he were only now realizing the harm he might have caused. John tried to shake these thoughts, but they kept returning, persistent as a whisper that wouldn't stop. A part of him resisted accepting that he might have been wrong, that the toughness he once prided himself on might have caused undeserved pain for the people he encountered. One night, overwhelmed by his feelings, he left his apartment, hoping the night air would calm him. But as he looked down at the empty streets, John felt like a stranger in the very city he had protected for years. The following morning during training, Rachel introduced a new exercise. Each person was asked to write about a time they felt they had hurt someone and wanted to apologize. John stared at the blank page in front of him, feeling as if it were an insurmountable barrier. He couldn't think of anything to write, or perhaps he simply didn't want to face his mistakes. He sat silently, full of conflicting emotions, while others began to write and share with sincerity. Rachel noticed his struggle and approached him gently. "John, we can't change the past, but acknowledging and learning from our mistakes is how we move forward." John looked up at Rachel, his eyes conflicted. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only shook his head in silence. He wasn't sure he could face the harm he had caused others, or accept that the values he had upheld all his life might have hurt those he was meant to protect. Rachel continued, "I know your work isn't easy, John, but maybe real strength isn't just about being tough and decisive. It's also about being able to reflect on how we affect the lives of others." Rachel's words touched something deep within John. He didn't respond, but a quiet understanding began to grow inside him. He sat there, gripping his pen tightly, but unable to write anything. Memories of his cold and rigid actions played in his mind, a chain of unending mistakes. That night, John couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, haunted by images of people he had treated unfairly. The sad eyes of the woman he had dragged out of her car, the disappointed look of the young man, and the grief-stricken mother's story about losing her son because of a police officer's bias. All of it echoed in his mind, giving him no rest. He walked to his living room, sat in an armchair, and stared at his police badge on the table. He remembered the pride he felt when he first received it, the feeling that he was becoming a protector of the community. But now he questioned whether he truly deserved it. John had always been certain he was in the right, that his toughness was necessary to maintain order. Yet now he wondered if that same toughness had stripped him of the humanity his job required. The next day, as the training continued, John no longer sat in the back row. He chose a seat closer to the front, a subtle sign that he was beginning to open himself up. When it came time to share, John finally decided to voice the emotions that had been weighing on him. "I've always believed that toughness is what makes a good cop," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I thought that following the law strictly and maintaining discipline was enough. But now, I'm not so sure. The stories you all have shared, I don't know anymore. They make me question everything I've done and believed in all these years." Rachel listened quietly, her gaze warm and understanding, without a hint of judgment. Sometimes, John, questioning yourself is the first step toward understanding. None of us are perfect, and none of us can avoid making mistakes. What matters is that you're willing to look back and make a change. John felt a part of his burden lift, but he couldn't avoid feeling lost. He wasn't sure if he could continue his job as a police officer without relying on the toughness he had always known. He wondered if there was a way to do his work while also treating people with empathy and understanding. This inner conflict wouldn't be easy to resolve, but day by day, John began to accept that true strength wasn't about always being right. It was about being willing to recognize and correct his mistakes. Although he didn't know where this new path would lead, he understood that this journey, though difficult, might offer him the chance to become both a better person and a better police officer. In the sessions that followed, John continued to attend, not to resist or justify himself, but to find answers to the questions in his heart. The stories, the looks, and even the tears of those in the class had opened his eyes to a new horizon, where strength was not just about rigidity, but about the ability to protect others with genuine compassion. After several weeks of empathy training, John Miller began stepping out of his comfort zone and joining Rachel in community activities. Despite the positive shift in his mindset, he still felt uneasy and uncomfortable around people who recognized him from his infamous incident. He sensed their judging glances. Some even avoided him. Each time he walked into a room, John could hear murmurs and see people turning away. He knew regaining trust wouldn't be easy, but now he was prepared to make the effort. At his first community event with Rachel at the downtown center, John felt out of place. His instincts told him that authority and toughness were the keys to earning respect. But watching Rachel engage effortlessly, chatting and connecting with everyone, he began to understand that respect might come not from power, but from sincerity and a genuine desire to help. He quietly observed Rachel as she smiled at each person, listening to their stories of hardships and challenges. When an elderly woman struggled to stand in line, Rachel quickly went over to assist, gently helping her to a nearby seat. This simple act of kindness surprised John. He had never seen his role this way, helping others without authority or pretense. While helping move donation boxes into the hall, John noticed a group of children running around, laughing. At first, he felt tense, worrying they might disrupt the order, but Rachel just smiled and said, "Sometimes you just have to let things unfold naturally." Her words made John pause. He realized that control wasn't always necessary. Sometimes letting go could create a stronger connection. One day, as John was packing up after an event, he noticed a small boy standing shyly at a street corner, clutching his backpack and glancing nervously at the crosswalk. Instinctively, John felt a pang of worry, but this time he approached without the sternness he used to wear like armor. Instead, he walked over slowly, using a gentle tone. "Do you want some help crossing the street?" John asked warmly. The boy looked up, hesitating before nodding slightly. "My mom says not to talk to strangers," he replied, his eyes cautious but innocent. John smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth inside. "Your mom's very smart, but I'm a police officer. I'll help you cross safely, okay?" The boy grinned, his eyes brightening as he looked at John's badge. John gently took his hand, waited for the light to turn green, and crossed with him. When they reached the other side, the boy released his hand and said with a cheerful voice, "Thank you, officer. You're nice." The boy's simple words moved John. It wasn't praise for his authority, but a heartfelt thanks for a simple act of kindness. He watched the boy run towards his house in the distance, feeling a genuine joy and purpose in his work, not in enforcing, but in protecting and supporting those around him. That small act opened something new in John's heart. The warmth he felt from helping others was unlike anything he had experienced in his rigid approach to law enforcement. The joy of helping, of using his strength to protect rather than to command, gave him a sense of true happiness. From that day on, John eagerly participated in community activities. Whenever he saw someone in need, he didn't hesitate to step in. While some people still eyed him with caution, his genuine gestures slowly helped them open up. A young mother who had once avoided him now smiled when she saw him helping her daughter pick up a fallen scarf. An elderly man who once shunned him from his property now greeted him with a nod whenever they crossed paths at the market. Rachel, who had been alongside John throughout this transformation, observed his progress with quiet joy. She saw that John was no longer the cold, unyielding officer she had once known, but a man rediscovering himself through acts of kindness. One day, as they were arranging donated gifts, Rachel said softly, "See, true strength often comes from the simplest acts. You're learning to be an officer in a new way, one grounded in kindness and empathy." John nodded thoughtfully. He knew his journey was far from over, but he no longer felt fear or resistance. Instead, he looked forward to the ways he could truly help his community. Each day, he realized that real strength wasn't in forcing others to comply, but in inspiring trust and hope through sincerity. By volunteering selflessly, John not only rediscovered his values, but also helped people see him in a new light. For him, each thank you, each trusting gaze from those he helped, served as proof of his profound change. For the first time in his life, John felt the true meaning of service, not as a means to control, but as a way to understand and stand beside others in their struggles. And with each action, each word, John knew he was becoming the person he had always wanted to be, a police officer who was not only strong in his duty, but compassionate in his heart. At the end of his empathy training, John Miller emerged as a changed man. The weeks he spent alongside Rachel, listening to profound stories, had transformed his views on policing. For the first time, he understood that strength wasn't solely about authority or toughness. It was also about empathy and the genuine desire to help others. He knew these lessons couldn't remain with him alone. He needed to share them with his colleagues, who, like him, could learn much from this experience. Together with Rachel, John launched a program called Bridge the Gap, designed to foster understanding between police officers and the community. The program aimed to organize meetings where officers and community members could listen to one another and find ways to resolve conflicts together. John saw this as an opportunity for officers to experience the power of kindness and empathy in fulfilling their duty. When the program was announced at a police station meeting, John felt the tension from his former colleagues. Many of them, just as he once believed, still saw discipline and firmness as the foundation of police work. Some officers even mocked the idea, seeing empathy training as too soft for law enforcement. During the meeting, a longtime colleague, Paul, stood up to voice his opposition. "We're here to maintain order, not to sit around listening to people's feelings. Our job is to arrest, not to help or understand." John could feel the tension in the room, but this time he didn't react with anger or rigidity as he might have in the past. He stood up, speaking calmly but firmly. "Paul, I understand where you're coming from. I used to think the same way, that our strength came from strictly enforcing discipline. But after going through the training, I've realized that real strength isn't just about control, it's also about genuinely helping the community." Paul shook his head, looking at John with doubt. "You've changed, John. You're not the officer we once knew. Maybe you've gone soft." John smiled, unbothered by Paul's comment. "Maybe I have changed, but not in the way you think. I'm not weaker. I've just come to understand that patience and empathy are essential in our work. We can protect our community by understanding them. We don't always have to impose our authority." A young officer, Sam, who once admired John for his decisiveness, also spoke up. "John, how can you believe that just listening to stories will help us maintain order? I don't see anything practical in this." John turned to Sam, his gaze steady. "Sam, I used to think that way too, but then I realized that people in the community aren't subjects we need to control. They're people with lives, families, and their pain. Understanding them doesn't make us weaker. It makes us better protectors. Every time we listen, we build trust. And with trust, we create cooperation, making it easier to solve problems without violence or force." John's calm and sincere words quieted the room. Even those who had once scoffed at him now listened with a new seriousness. He continued, "During training, I met people who have been hurt by our rigid ways. They've lost trust in us, and that's something we need to regain. Without empathy and sincerity, we're just doing our jobs mechanically, not truly protecting anyone." Paul sat down, his expression softening as he considered John's words. John knew it wouldn't be easy to shift everyone's mindset. It would take time. But he also realized he wasn't alone in this journey. After the meeting, a few officers approached John. Among them was Lisa, who had always believed in a strict approach to policing. "John," she said quietly, "I used to think you were wasting time with this empathy training. But after hearing what you said, I'm genuinely curious. Maybe I'll try joining Bridge the Gap." John smiled, feeling a surge of hope. He realized that his patience and willingness to share his experiences had begun to resonate. One by one, his colleagues were starting to reconsider and wonder about the importance of empathy in their work. On the first day of Bridge the Gap, John and Rachel stood before a group of officers and community members at the community center. The atmosphere was tense initially, but John was prepared for the challenge. He began with his own story, sharing his mistakes and the biases he had carried with him on the job. "I used to believe that toughness and authority were everything, but now I realize that part of this job is protecting. And to protect, we need to understand our community," John said, looking around at everyone in the room. "Today, I hope we can all work together to build a bridge of trust, so we can do our jobs not just with authority, but with heart." Rachel stood beside him, smiling with pride. She knew that John had come a long way to reach this point, and now he was becoming a role model for others in the force. The first meeting of Bridge the Gap ended with open conversations and friendly handshakes, and John realized that little by little, change was happening. With Bridge the Gap, John not only transformed his own perspective, but also hoped to create a police force closer to the community, a place where real strength came from understanding and empathy. He knew the journey ahead would bring more challenges, but now John was ready to face it with all the sincerity and determination he had found within himself. The day of the community gathering arrived faster than John Miller expected. Unlike the formal ceremonies he had once attended as an officer, this time he entered with a completely different perspective. Not as an authoritative figure, but as a sincere individual, ready to confront his past mistakes in front of the public. The room was silent, with curious, skeptical eyes watching him. John could feel his heart pounding, but he knew he needed to do this. Rachel waited near the stage, offering him a gentle smile of encouragement as he stepped up. She had guided him through this journey, helping him see the true purpose of protection and service. Taking a deep breath, John looked out over the crowd. Some faces held doubt, others even disapproval. He knew that this apology was more than just words. It was his commitment to change in the community. He began to speak, his voice steady but sincere. "Today I stand here not as an officer wielding authority, but as a person who has made mistakes, asking for forgiveness and striving to make amends. I know that in the past, I took actions that hurt people and caused many of you to lose trust in law enforcement. I used to believe that strength in policing came from toughness and authority, but I was wrong." He paused, looking down at Rachel, who gave him an encouraging nod. He continued, "Rachel helped me see that real strength doesn't lie in power or control, but in compassion, in the ability to understand and empathize with others. Thanks to her, and all of you, I've had the chance to reflect and reevaluate my actions." In the audience, a few people nodded silently, their expressions softening. Some still appeared skeptical, but John pushed on. He knew that regaining trust would require more than words. Today was just his first step. "I want to apologize to Rachel and all of you for my mistakes. I am sorry that my rigidity and biases once overshadowed my duty to serve and protect. Today, I stand here to promise that from this moment forward, I will do everything within my power to serve this community with fairness and sincerity." As his apology echoed in the room, silence followed. Then Rachel stood, stepped onto the stage, and held out her hand. John looked at her, his gaze filled with gratitude and remorse, and took her hand in a gesture of reconciliation and forgiveness. It was a simple handshake, yet deeply symbolic, a testament to his sincerity and her compassion. An older man broke the silence, calling out from the back, "John, I once thought you'd never change. But seeing you here today, I believe everyone deserves a chance to make things right. Thank you for having the courage to face your past." Others began to step forward. A woman who had once experienced injustice due to John's actions walked up to him, extending her hand with a tearful yet forgiving expression. "Not everyone dares to apologize publicly like this. Thank you for choosing to change," she said. John felt an overwhelming sense of relief. These words of forgiveness and encouragement were a gift. and he knew that earning acceptance required relentless effort. But he was ready for this new journey, a path defined not by authority, but by empathy and commitment. Another man approached, clasping John's hand firmly. "John, we don't expect you to be perfect, but as long as you lead with compassion, we'll stand by you." Rachel watched with pride, her eyes shining with admiration. She knew that John had faced countless challenges and inner struggles to reach this moment. She looked at him with respect, not just for his transformation, but for his bravery in confronting his mistakes. The ceremony concluded in a warm, friendly atmosphere. John stood at the exit, shaking hands and thanking each person. An elderly woman who had once opposed his presence in the community clasped his hand, smiled gently, and said, "Son, we all make mistakes, but what matters is whether we dare to make amends." With every handshake and every smile, John felt a profound connection with the community. The resentment and mistrust that once lingered were fading, replaced by empathy and a shared hope for a brighter future. As everyone departed, John and Rachel stayed behind, taking in the quiet hall with gratitude and joy. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "You did it, John. This is only the beginning, but it has already changed everything." John nodded, his gaze filled with determination. He knew his journey was far from over, and he would need to work tirelessly to uphold the promises he made today. But he was ready, with an open heart and a renewed sense of purpose. The lessons from Bridge the Gap were no longer just part of a training session. They had become his guiding principles for the path ahead. "Thank you, Rachel. I wouldn't have seen the person I wanted to become without you," he said, his eyes filled with gratitude. They left the hall together, and John knew that from this day forward, he would never walk alone. He had a community, allies like Rachel, and above all, the conviction that he could transform into a better police officer, a protector grounded in empathy and justice. And for him, that was the true strength he had been seeking all along. And after the moving community ceremony, John Miller felt more certain than ever about his new mission. He realized that Bridge the Gap wasn't just a temporary empathy training. It held the potential to transform how the police interact with the community. The idea excited him. If he, once rigid and resistant, could change, then anyone could. So why not expand Bridge the Gap as a core part of police training, ensuring that recruits understood the true purpose of their role from day one? John shared this idea with Rachel, who immediately supported it. "Yes, John, if we can build a strong foundation from the start, where every officer learns to understand and empathize with the people they serve, we could change the entire culture of the department. Think about the recruits who could learn from your journey." Encouraged by Rachel, John scheduled a meeting with Captain Martinez to present his vision. Martinez had witnessed John's transformation and understood this was more than just a proposal. It was John's sincere commitment to the community. In the captain's office, John outlined his desire to make Bridge the Gap an integral part of police training, explaining that if officers learned to understand the community from the beginning, they'd be able to handle situations with compassion and effectiveness. Captain Martinez listened thoughtfully, nodding occasionally. When John finished, he paused and said, "John, I've seen how much you've changed and how the community has come to accept you again. This idea could be revolutionary for our department, and I think you're the perfect person to lead it." Martinez's words deeply moved John. He had never imagined he'd have the opportunity to lead such a meaningful initiative. But now he realized that this responsibility wasn't just an honor. It was a way to give back and make amends with the community. With support from Rachel and Captain Martinez, John began outlining a comprehensive plan for Bridge the Gap. They held meetings with community representatives, gathering input from residents. Rachel, acting as a bridge between the police and the community, invited members from various backgrounds, including social activists, teachers, and individuals who had experienced challenges with law enforcement. Each participant brought unique insights, helping John and Rachel craft a program that was both practical and impactful. One core element of the program was storytelling and real-life experience sharing. John believed that stories like Rachel's, and even his own, could greatly influence new recruits. They also introduced role-playing sessions where officers would interact with citizens in simulated scenarios, focusing on resolving issues with empathy rather than force. John also proposed that Bridge the Gap be mandatory for all experienced officers as part of their ongoing training. "This isn't just a program for rookies," he said in a meeting. "Every one of us can learn and grow. I'm proof of that." While many supported the idea, there was also resistance, especially from colleagues who still believed in a hardline approach. Some voiced concerns, saying the program was a waste of time and unnecessary for their work. "We're police officers, not therapists," one officer remarked during a meeting. This time, however, John didn't react angrily or defensively. He calmly explained, "I used to think the same way, but after going through this program, I've learned that understanding and respecting the community makes our job easier and safer. This isn't about weakening our role, it's about enhancing our effectiveness and building trust." Gradually, John's patience and sincerity started to shift opinions. Some officers grew curious and agreed to try a few sessions. John's and Rachel's stories, along with the real-life experiences shared by community members, began to change perspectives. A young officer who had initially rejected the program approached John after a session, admitting, "John, I think you were right. Maybe I've been too rigid and forgot that our purpose is to protect and serve." Under John's leadership, Bridge the Gap became an integral part of the police department's culture. Each month, officers would meet with community members to listen, share, and learn from one another's experiences. The training sessions were no longer seen as a mandatory task, but as an opportunity to deepen officers' understanding of their role. Rachel, who had supported John every step of the way, saw the remarkable changes within the department and felt a deep sense of pride. "You did it, John," she said after a particularly successful training. "You've made this program part of the department, and I believe this will bring lasting change." John smiled, filled with hope and pride. From being a once criticized officer, he had become a leader in meaningful reform. He hadn't just transformed himself, he had helped build a more connected and compassionate police department, where each officer understood that strength wasn't solely about authority, but also about empathy and kindness. With Bridge the Gap, John and Rachel created a solid foundation for collaboration, understanding, and respect between police officers and the community. As John reflected on his journey, he realized that every struggle and mistake had led him to this moment, a new beginning, not just for him, but for the community he had pledged to serve. John Miller's story reminds us that change is always possible, even if it starts from our biggest mistakes. What do you think about John's journey of transformation? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with more inspiring tales. See you next time.